Imagine a place through which nearly 20% of the world's oil passes every single day. A narrow sea lane that is the lifeline of the global economy. And then one day, it suddenly becomes almost impossible to pass through. In late February 2026, exactly this happened. The Strait of Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf was no longer a normal shipping route. A place that had been stable for decades suddenly became a war zone. It all began on 28 February 2026 when the United States and Israel carried out multiple military strikes inside Iran. These strikes were not part of a small tension. They were part of a large conflict that had already been escalating. The Israel-Iran war that had been building quietly now exploded openly. Iran responded immediately. Missiles, drones, and attacks on regional energy and military infrastructure began. The Gulf region became a high-risk combat zone, but the biggest move was yet to come. Iran decided to use its most powerful strategic position, the Strait of Hormuz. This is not just a waterway, it is a choke point through which a large portion of the world's energy supply passes, and Iran holds geographical control over this crucial passage. On 28 February, the situation began to change drastically. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Navy started issuing warnings over maritime radio channels. Commercial ships were told that passage through the strait was not allowed, and any vessel attempting to enter could be attacked. This was not just a warning, it was a signal that the area was no longer safe. Ships reacted immediately. Some vessels turned back midway, some stayed in port, and others waited because no one knew what would happen next. Fast boats and naval craft were reported in the water and on the surface. Everywhere there was uncertainty. Every captain felt that one wrong decision could mean disaster for the ship crew and cargo. Then the situation intensified further. After the warnings, attacks were reported. Both merchant vessels and energy infrastructure were targeted. The threat was no longer hypothetical. It had become a real danger. For shipping companies, there was only one question: take the risk or stop everything. And this is where a chain reaction began, one that would affect the entire world. Because when such a major oil route is disrupted, the impact does not remain limited to a single region. This is not just the story of a strait. This is the story of a global power struggle. And this is only the beginning. By early March 2026, the Strait of Hormuz had shifted from a busy shipping lane into one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Every ship passing through this narrow passage faced uncertainty and fear. Every captain and crew member knew that one wrong decision could have catastrophic consequence. The United States and Israel had struck targets inside Iran just days earlier, and the strikes had triggered a rapid and calculated response from Tehran. Missiles, drones, and attacks on regional energy and military infrastructure transformed the Gulf into a high-risk combat zone. The air hummed with tension while fast attack boats and naval craft prowled the waters, ready to intercept any vessel that dared to enter. This was not a test. It was a message. A warning made real by the presence of lethal force on every side. On March 2, 2026, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared that passage through the strait could be met with attack. The announcement spread instantly through maritime communication channels, and every commercial operator faced the same impossible choice: continue and risk everything or stop and abandon critical shipments. The effect was immediate. Ships that had once flowed through the strait like clockwork began to turn back or remain idle in ports for days. The traffic that normally exceeded 100 vessels a day dropped to almost nothing. The waterway remained physically open, but practically the route had collapsed, and analysts began referring to it as a virtual closure. Insurance companies responded as quickly as the shipping lines. The risk of sending a vessel into a war zone skyrocketed. Premiums multiplied, and for many companies, sending a tanker through the strait simply became uninsurable. The combination of physical threat and financial impossibility created a feedback loop where fear reinforced itself. Every captain hesitated, every operator recalculated, every insurer refused to underwrite without extraordinary conditions. The strait was still there, the water still stretched across the Gulf, But the system that allowed safe passage had broken down, and no one could predict when it might return to normal. Iran's strategy was clear: every step calculated to maximize leverage over the global economy. Controlling this choke point meant controlling not just local shipping but influencing markets across continents. Every spike in oil prices, every delay in energy supply, every hesitation in commerce became a tool of pressure. The world began to feel the ripple effects as Brent crude surged past $100 per barrel, and markets everywhere reacted not just to the supply crunch, but to the fear that a critical artery of the global economy could remain unstable for weeks or months. The tension was palpable in ports across Asia, Europe, and the Americas, while governments and energy firms scrambled to adjust their plans. What had begun as warnings on radio channels had evolved into a fully orchestrated environment of danger and control. Mines, drones, missile systems, and electronic jamming made even the idea of transit a high-stakes gamble. The Strait of Hormuz had become a living test of decision-making under extreme pressure, and as the world watched, every movement, every announcement, every flare of conflict mattered. Every delay, every turn back, every empty port became part of a story that was larger than a single region, larger than a single conflict, larger than any one nation. Because in early 2026, the strait was no longer just a waterway. It had become the focal point of global power, tension, and survival. Now, the world is left waiting. The Strait of Hormuz remains under Iran's control, and every nation that depends on it feels the tension. There is no confirmed date for reopening, no guarantee that commercial vessels can pass freely, and every day of uncertainty adds pressure across continents. Diplomatic channels buzz with negotiations. Multiple governments push for talks, and calls for de-escalation grow louder. Major global players urge stability and restraint, because everyone understands what is at stake. Energy, security, global trade, and economic balance all hang in the balance. Yet Iran retains leverage and control every step of the way, and that leverage shapes decisions far beyond the Gulf region. Inside the strait, a selective system governs who may pass. Certain ships are allowed under strict conditions. Cargo and crew details are scrutinized, payments are monitored, and approvals granted only to those deemed acceptable. Every transit becomes a calculated risk for shipping companies and insurers. Captains hesitate and crews remain on edge, because the threats have not disappeared. They have evolved. Mines, drones, missile systems, and electronic interference turn open water into a high-stakes gauntlet where one misstep can trigger disaster. Outside the strait, the ripple effects continue to grow. Oil prices remain volatile, supply chains struggle, and governments scramble to respond. The global economy feels the strain, from energy shortages to rising transport costs, from delayed shipments to disrupted markets. Every sector that depends on the smooth flow of goods experiences pressure, and every empty port is a reminder that the disruption is not theoretical. It is real and ongoing. Even regional economies in the Gulf face domestic strain. Food and energy distribution challenges and rising costs demonstrate how a single choke point can destabilize entire societies. Analysts estimate that reopening could take weeks or months, depending on negotiations, de-escalation, and changes in military conditions. But all predictions are uncertain. The conflict could escalate or slow, and the timeline could shift suddenly and without warning. Every day that passes, the world is reminded of its dependence on a few critical arteries of global commerce, and how vulnerable those arteries are to strategy, conflict, and human decision-making. In early 2026, the Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a waterway. It is a test of strategy, risk, and global resilience. It shows how geography, power, and conflict intersect to create consequences far beyond a single region. It proves that control over one narrow passage can influence economies, governments, and lives across the planet, and that the balance of risk and leverage is delicate. fragile and intensely consequential. As nations negotiate and prepare to act, as markets fluctuate and shipping companies weigh every decision, the world watches and waits. The outcome of this crisis will shape global energy flows, financial stability, and international relations for years to come. And for the crews waiting in ports for clearance, for the tankers stranded in the Gulf, for the governments balancing diplomacy and defense, the Strait of Hormuz is more than a choke point. It is the focal point of a struggle that connects every corner of the modern world, and every choice made within this narrow strip of water resonates far beyond its shores. The story of the Strait of Hormuz in early 2026 is a story of power, strategy, risk, and survival, a story of how a single waterway can become the center of global attention, a story that reminds the world that stability is fragile, control is powerful, and every decision has consequences that reach across oceans and nations. Will Iran reopen the Strait of Hormuz? Will the Strait of Hormuz reopen? And when could that happen? Do you think it should be reopened? Share your opinion in the comments below. See you in the next exciting video. Until then, goodbye.